We all know the image, the steel-clad warrior standing on the shores of the New World, gazing at a horizon full of gold and glory. History tells us these men were driven by a lust for power, by religious zeal, or by a demonic greed. Hernan Cortez was a desperate man running from a loan shark. Before the history books got a hold of him, Cortez was a failed law student. He arrived in the colonies in 1504, hoping for an easy payday. But for his first decade and a half, his adventures mostly consisted of seducing other people's wives and getting into trouble with local governors. In 1518, he finally finagled his way into commanding an expedition to the mainland. His very first move was to go shopping. According to soldiers who were there, he bought a plume of feathers, a gold chain, and a velvet cloak trimmed with loops of gold. He wanted to look like a bold, successful captain. He had absolutely no money to pay for any of it. The conquest of the Americas began as a heavily leveraged, fraudulent enterprise, bankrolled by a man frantically trying to fake his own net worth. We are taught that when Cortez arrived in Mexico, he burned his own ships to send a message to his men: victory or death, a legendary military tactic. But his personal ledger reveals a different motivation. To pay for that velvet cloak and the fleet itself, Cortez borrowed 4,000 gold pesos from merchant friends, putting up his entire estate as collateral. He literally bet the farm. To make matters worse, the local governor had ordered him to cancel the expedition. Cortez ignored him. Sailing back to Cuba without a mountain of gold meant immediate surrender to a debtor's prison. He destroyed the ships because he was a fugitive who couldn't afford the cost of a return ticket or the jail cell waiting for him. Cortez bluffs and fights his way inland, eventually taking the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma hostage inside his own palace in Tenochtitlan. While waiting for the conflict to boil over, the two men sat around playing a board game called Totoloque, placing bets on the outcome. Aztec games often featured rules where a freak stroke of luck granted instant, total victory. Moctezuma was a warrior king, accepting these sudden losses as signs of cosmic destiny. Cortez, on the other hand, blatantly and repeatedly cheated. When Moctezuma's courtiers pointed out the cheating, the emperor just laughed. Cortez was stealing chips off the table because he was terrified of missing the monthly interest payments on his stolen fleet. This clash of civilizations was a mismatch. On one side, an emperor waiting for the gods to reveal the fate of the world. On the other, a grifter sweating over his financial obligations. After months of grueling warfare, Tenochtitlan fell. The Spanish soldiers broke into the imperial treasury, finally securing the massive payout they had dreamed of since leaving Europe. But when the loot was divided, the math collapsed. First, the royal tax was deducted, then Cortez took his personal cut. Then the immense expenses for outfitting the horses were subtracted. These soldiers arrived in Mexico already drowning in debt. They purchased their swords, crossbows, and intricate plate armor on credit from their own commanding officers. On top of wildly inflated prices for weapons, they were even billed for the battlefield medical care that saved their lives during the siege. Here is the financial reality. After helping to destroy an empire and standing on a mountain of Aztec gold, the average soldier received only 50 to 80 pesos. Once their debts were tallied, their net worth was lower than when the war started. Realizing they were thousands of miles from home and trapped in a massive financial deficit, the soldiers panicked. Surrounded by creditors demanding payment, they turned their attention toward the indigenous population. They began to extract gold and silver with terrifying efficiency. Priests like Fray Motolinía reported that around the mines of Oaxaca, the landscape was so littered with the corpses of overworked indigenous people that you could scarcely avoid stepping on their bones. The soldiers branded the faces of the indigenous population. Alongside the royal seal, they scorched the names of every individual owner who had bought and sold them. The insatiable greed of the conquistador grew out of structural necessity. They were part of a violent Ponzi scheme, where the only way to pay off the debts of the last expedition was to launch a new, bigger one, literally converting human beings into endorsed checks to satisfy compounding interest. Did stealing the treasury of an entire civilization finally allow Hernan Cortez to dig his way out of his financial hole? 5 years after the conquest, while Cortez was off on another expedition in Honduras, his creditors were actively repossessing his house. He spent his final years completely broke, eventually reduced to pawning his wife's jewelry to fund a desperate expedition to California, hoping to find another empire to loot. Cortes was a single node in a vast chain. Soldiers owed captains, captains owed merchants, and merchants owed European bankers. In Seville, bankers created credit instruments that multiplied the value of New World gold before it crossed the Atlantic. The colonial apparatus functioned as a continent-spanning machine designed to convert human life into interest payments. Society frames paying one's debts as the primary definition of an honorable person. It is the baseline of modern morality. When you define a human being primarily as a debtor, you strip away their humanity. You reduce them to a math problem. If the only way to solve that math problem is to work thousands of people to death in a mine, the violence is justified as just doing business. History is rarely shaped by grand monsters or legendary heroes. Most often, the worst atrocities are committed by desperate people making horrific decisions to satisfy the pressure of compound interest.